Good morning. It is Wednesday, February the 9th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Declaration of Independence, or the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star Spangled Banner, we will have the No Free Lunch and Voulez Vous coucher avec moi ce soir. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 9th. I will break the curse of sickness and disease. If you do not obey me and do not carefully follow my words, I will plague you with disease, fever, and inflammation until you are destroyed. But if you will serve me, the Lord your God, my blessing will be on your food and water. I have redeemed your life from the pit, and I have crowned you with love and compassion. I satisfy all your desires with good things, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. My precious Son has destroyed the curse of the law and has redeemed you and healed you by his sacrifice. He took your pain and bore your suffering. By his wounds you are healed, and he has given my people the authority to drive out demons and to cure diseases. Therefore, go forth and proclaim my kingdom on earth and heal the sick. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 15, Psalm 103, verses 1 through 5, Luke chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Prayer declaration. Father, I am your child and you are my God. I stand in your righteousness and in the wholeness and life that you have given to me through the sacrifice of your Son, Jesus. Your Son, Jesus, took all my sins and sickness upon himself, and he has given me and my loved ones the privilege of walking in wholeness, body, soul, and spirit. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 9th. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you, thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. In a commercial world, we bump regularly against strangers, but the strangers become friends. To my friends, the communitarians, I say, your sweet ends are achieved precisely by commerce. Deidre N. McCloskey. Rather than demonize business, we ought to embrace the social reality that community is enhanced by trade and commerce. To believe that we create fuller communities by denying them free exchange with one another is to assert the idiotic. In the context of commercial endeavors, true friendships can be born. Not always, but certainly often. In the context of a commerce-free world, social alienation is assured. And there's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, Voulez Vous coucher avec moi ce soir? Al Jolson's jazz singer it was not. But in 1978, the otherwise obscure production company Satori Films achieved a motion picture breakthrough all the same. It released a movie titled Secrets, in which Jacqueline Bisset enacted a graphic 5-minute sex scene entirely nude. Before Secrets, named actresses in American feature films did not strip for the camera. Verna Lisi tore up a contract with United Artists in '68 rather than appear in the skimpy costumes designed for Barbarella. And risque as that movie was, in its big sex scene, Jane Fonda was exposed only from the neck up. So strong was the taboo, in fact, that Satori hesitated for 7 years after the 1971 shooting of Secrets before letting it out the door. By then, the producers must have had difficulty remembering what they'd been afraid of. On-screen grappling and grasping had become as familiar a theatrical convention as the tenor aria was 150 years ago. Suddenly, the pop stations on the radio pushed the copulatory rhythms of disco. Push, push in the bush. Voulez vous coucher avec moi ce soir? That's the way, I like it, On the middle-of-the-road stations, Tennille crooned, "Do that to me one more time," to her piano-playing captain. Respectable bookstores stocked items that would have been hauled off by the Vice Squad half a dozen years earlier. Dell's paperback edition of The Happy Hooker sold 6.6 million copies by the mid-1973, 100,000 copies more than the year's best-selling non-smut paperback Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Bob Guccione's Penthouse eclipsed the sales of Playboy by publishing graphic pictures of female genitalia and lesbian sex. Larry Flint's Hustler carved out a niche for more obscene stuff still. Manhattan office workers could stroll over their lunch hour to the theaters where Noel Coward's tinkling comedies used to play and watch live sex shows. Softcore films like Flash Gordon were screening on Main Street in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Topeka, Kansas. A central figure in the Watergate scandal was given the title of a XXX movie about fellatio as its nickname, and the ambitious production values and sustained storyline of 1973's The Devil and Miss Jones prompted Variety to comment that hardcore pornography has become an art form that critics may have a hard time ignoring. By century's end, more than 20 million U.S. households were connected to cable or dish television systems that offer the softcore Playboy channel. Hardcore pornographic movies were available at the flick of a switch in almost 1 million of the nation's hotel rooms. Daytime soaps have sex scenes that once would have earned movies an R rating, while evening situation comedies string one salacious remark after another. The internet puts high-quality photographs of sex with children, animals, and people in wheelchairs in easy reach of anyone with a credit card. In the 1970s, Donna Summer became nationally notorious for simulating orgasm in her disco hits. Many stations simply banned her music outright for fear of what their listeners and the FCC might say. A quarter century later, Madonna simulated masturbation in a musical number at the Grammy Awards, and nobody thought much of it. Virtually nobody expected anything like this back in 1966, when the Supreme Court effectively voided America's obscenity laws. It's positively quaint to reread the words of Justice Tom Clark's dissent in that case. I have stomached past cases for almost 10 years without much outcry, though I am not known to be a purist or a shrinking violet. This book is too much even for me. And what was that intolerable book that drove Clark over the edge? John Cleland's Fanny Hill. Compared to what was coming next, Fanny Hill looks like a high school English text. Clark, a stolid and conventional Democratic politician born in 1899, could not have possibly glimpsed the future. On the other hand, neither could the judges who ruled in favor of Fanny Hill. Their mental image of the sort of book endangered by obscenity prosecutions seems to have been set sometime about 1930. Ulysses may be, or possibly, Lady Chatterley's lover. Over the next few years, the court discovered otherwise and frantically attempted to resurrect the old smashed standards in a series of cases that gave the states the power to proscribe materials deemed obscene by local communities. But the flow of obscenity that commenced in 1966 had by then done its work. Local standards were no longer what they used to be. A very great many Americans, too, had absorbed the notion that, in the words of a Unitarian clergyman quoted in Justice Douglas's opinion in the crucial 1966 obscenity case, self-control and self-expression are at opposite ends of the continuum. If we want people to behave in a structured and predictable manner, then the ideal of creativity cannot have meaning. The notion that self-discipline stifles creativity, anathema to artists but dear to the artistic, held unusual sway in the late 60s. In the name of creativity, aesthetic standards were junked and rules of speech and conduct jettisoned. Words that men once were supposed never to utter in front of women were delightedly seized by women writers like Erica Young, who sprinkled them across her best-selling pages like paprika upon goulash. The release of the obscenity-strewn Nixon Watergate tapes had shocked the president's small-town supporters. Some Republicans believe, in fact, that the deleted expletives were the most damaging of all the Watergate revelations. It was an appropriate irony that in 1976, All the President's Men achieved the distinction of becoming the first movie to use the word fuck and not be slapped with an X rating. The great party of the 1970s was on. Here's Richard Avedon's May 1974 photo spread in Vogue, in which a beautiful woman has collapsed into exhaustion atop two sleepy, satiated men. Here again is Helmut Newton's May 1975 shoot, in which a luscious blonde looks demurely downward as the man behind her reaches two hands around to unclasp her bra. When readers expressed shock, Vogue's editor, Grace Mirabella, affected total puzzlement. "We were only looking for a picture," she demurely explained, that conveyed the information that the bra in question opened from the front. It was Mirabella, not her shocked readers, who was in touch with the times. For centuries, for millennia, the job of saying no had been the woman's responsibility. As late as 1972, when the National Opinion Research Center first began probing male and female sexual attitudes, a solid majority of American women condemned premarital sex as immoral. The NORC survey offered 4 alternative answers. Premarital sex was always wrong, almost always wrong, wrong only sometimes, or not wrong at all. In 1972, only 20% of women said that premarital sex was not wrong at all. Almost twice as many men, 35%, did so. While 60% of men gave one or the other of the 2 permissive answers, 56% of women gave one or the other of the restrictive ones. Between 1970 and 1980, these lingering inhibitions flew straight out the window. Feminists like Germaine Greer championed promiscuity as a means to break women's dog-like devotion to men. And the young women of the 1970s listened and obeyed. More than two-thirds of the women who turned 18 between the end of the Korean War and the Kennedy inauguration acknowledged sleeping with only one man as of their 30th birthday, their fiancé or husband, presumably. Only 2% of the women who turned 18 between 1971 and 1980 could say the same thing on their 30th birthdays. Only slightly more than 2% of the women who came of age in the 1950s had slept with 5 or more men by their 30th birthday. 22.5% of the post-Vietnam group had carved that many notches in their bedpost. I remember feeling really weird because I hadn't slept with more guys than were on my 2 hands, said one of the characters in Naomi Wolf's memoir of her 1970s adolescence. Wolf continued, the women agreed that the girls we knew expected to have slept with anywhere from 10 to 30 guys by the time we were in college. If you hadn't at least made a start, you were repressed or geeky or inexperienced. A real pejorative. Back in a minute. Thank you. Nice Girls Do, proclaimed a 1980 bestseller. Between 1972 and 1982, the proportion of American women who fully or conditionally endorse premarital sex jumped by nearly 20 percentage points to 58%, with fully 36% of women now espousing the ultra-permissive view that premarital sex was not wrong at all. Tentatively at first, but with rising confidence, women were claiming unrestricted erotic freedom. Their parents sighed and shrugged their shoulders. In 1967, 85% of the parents of college-age young people condemned premarital sex as morally wrong. By 1979, only 37% of parents still held out against the trend of the times. As women experimented sexually, they came to regard men in new ways. Gore Vidal remarks that until the middle 1960s, when you looked at a man, you saw a loose shirt, a tie, and a shoe shine, and a hat. The male costume nearly identified a male's position in society, but it concealed him as a sexual creature. Not anymore. The 1970s saw the greatest revolution in men's clothing since swallowtail coats and knee breeches passed out of fashion almost 2 centuries ago. Super tight double-knit crotch-hugging pants, ripped open shirts with a medallion between the pectorals, platform shoes for height, moussed and blow-dried hair, the whole panoply of disco wear leapt across the lines of class, race, and sexual orientation to become the evening garb of Midwestern college boys. Before 1965, women tended to judge potential mates in much the same way that a steel company might assess a new blast furnace. Will it throw off sufficient income to justify the trouble of acquiring and maintaining it? The clothes a man put on for a date were chosen to broadcast a simple but powerful message. I am a steady, reliable fellow who will be able to provide for you and yours. As women acquired economic independence, they also acquired the means to look at men in a new way. They were just desserts, as a 1983 bestseller nicely phrased it. In 1973, 3/4 of the young women surveyed by Daniel Yankelevich identified concern for a woman's sexual satisfaction as one of the most important qualities in a man. Being a good provider followed well behind. Alex Comfort, the British pacifist who published The Joy of Sex in 1972, speculated, hopefully, the day may come when we regard chastity as no more a virtue than malnutrition. One good vantage point from which to watch the coming of that day is the historical romance novel, a theater for the fantasies of millions of women. Before 1970, this pornography for women was sexual only by implication. Its dominating presence was Dame Barbara Cartland, whose heroines invariably preserved their purity unspotted to their wedding day. The blushing conventions of the genre were blown to smithereens in 1972 by a previously unknown writer named Kathleen E. Woodiwas. Her novel, The Flame and the Flower, was discovered in the slush pile by the chief editor at Avon, Nancy Coffey, who somehow managed to struggle through the mauve prose of the first chapter to reach page 28, where the rakish hero, Captain Brandon Birmingham, strips and rapes the beautiful orphan Heather Simmons. She stood fixed to the floor until he stepped forward, and with a frightened squeak, she turned to flee, but found her arm squeezed in a grip that was gentle yet as unyielding as a band of steel. Helplessly, she is forced onto a bunk. She felt his hardness searching, probing between her thighs. This was something new. Despite the misgivings of coffee superiors, did women really want to read about hardness probing them? The Flame in the Flower was pushed into paperback, where it sold 4.5 million copies over the next 6 years. It continues in print to this day. Shortly afterward, a manuscript appeared in that same Avon slush pile from a Rosemary Rogers, addressed only to the editor of Kathleen Woodiwiss. The book would be published in 1974 as Sweet Savage Love. Unlike the victimized Heather Simmons, nobody needed to rape the heroine of Sweet Savage Love. It is she who makes the decision to surrender her virginity to the forceful stranger who has dragged her underneath a Conestoga wagon, kidnapped and dragged across the southwestern United States and into the middle of the war between Benito Juarez and the Emperor Maximilian. She happily carries on with 3 men at once before ending for good in the arms of the Conestoga man. Sweet Savage Love sold 10 million copies in the first 3 years after publication. It too remained in print a quarter century later. Sweet Savage Love convinced American publishers that a grand national trend had been born, and they scrambled to market ever racier stories to women. Rogers followed with a second novel, Wicked Loving Lies, in which the impetuous, self-sufficient heroine sleeps with half a dozen men in 483 pages. Jennifer Wilde, actually a pseudonym of a male author, produced Love's Tender Fury, in which the heroine is sold into slavery and serves in a brothel. More than 2 million copies were bought. Here's a 1976 ad in Publishers Weekly for Savage Eden by Constance Gluys, for the huge and growing market for women's historical fiction, a brand new blockbuster from NAL. It's the story of a beautiful Caroline Fane, unjustly accused of adultery and murder, flogged naked in public, and Justin Lawrence, the daring, flamboyant highwayman whose lust for Caroline was irresistible. Together they escape to the New World, only to be recaptured and sold into slavery. In the untamed, violent world of the notorious plantation known as Montrose, they fight for survival against brutal master and a sadistic mistress with monstrous erotic appetites, and, in spite of every obstacle, fulfill their fierce and tender love for each other. In Barbara Reif's 1977 book, Far Beyond Desire, the heroine is abducted and repeatedly gang-raped. Unlike male stroke literature, books like Sweet Savage Love and Love's Tender Fury were not read furtively. They were reviewed in newspapers and opened on the bus. Their success encouraged mid-market writers like Danielle Steele and Judith Krantz, whose books cost $10.95 in hardcover and were sold in bookstores to jettison old inhibitions and pack their fantasies with sex, sex, sex. For 200 years, writers used the alleged depravity of the wealthy to conceal sex inside a tale of moral uplift. Virtue is rewarded, but only after lots of exciting scenes in which the virtuous maiden wriggles deliciously in the evil hands of the bad baronet. Steele and Krantz junked that tradition. For them, the careless sexual abandon they attributed to the rich was just one more fabulous lifestyle detail, like private jets and ski chalets. They served up the trash heroine with her own wealth and her skillfully juggled lovers as a model for the independent-minded young women. This is how it's done. She feels no shame. Why should you? When Edith Wharton's new Newland Archer expostulates, women ought to be free as we are, Wharton allows him to puff his cigar for only a moment before tartly commenting he was too irritated to measure the terrific consequences of his words. High on the list of those consequences was the disappearance of the old male entitlement to sexual exclusivity. Only 15 years before, Wharton published The Age of Innocence. Pittsburgh millionaire Harry K. Thaw had jolted New York by murdering the great architect Stanford White on the roof of Madison Square Garden because White had seduced the then 16-year-old Evelyn Nesbit. Thaw's future wife, 3 separate juries refused to convict Thaw. If Thaw had wanted, he could have piled his precedents as high as the courtroom's elevated ceiling. In the savage portrayal of depravity of the pre-revolutionary French aristocracy, a boy who discovers that the girl he loves has been tampered with by an older man discards her and then kills him. And as the interloper lies dying, he forgives the boy and agrees that his death is just. The sudden and total disappearance of the ideal of bridal virginity has to be reckoned one of the more astonishing psychological developments in recent American history. Here was something that men once killed and died over, and poof, it's gone. It did not quite go without a pang. The reading and television watching public had to be barraged with warnings about the unacceptability of old-fangled male possessiveness. Most people learned to live comfortably with ghosts of love's past, one advice book reassuringly cooed. Not only that, but in many societies around the world, including the Eskimo, the Marquesans, the Lobi of West Africa, the Siriono of Bolivia, and others, jealousy is at a minimum, and as still others, such as the Toda of India, it is almost completely absent. Let your husband read your old love letters, suggested a book by a pseudonymous couple who claimed to lead a particularly active sex life. It might please him to know that your other men loved and desired you before he met you, but that he got you. If not, then he could solve the sting by talking out his feelings, meditating, or reading some classic words of wisdom like the I Ching or the Desiderata. The Desiderata, imagine Thaw cheering himself up with that. But guess what? It worked. Whatever hesitations and doubts the elder generation might feel about the new rules, the young adapted to them cheerfully. A 1972 poll of boys aged 16 to 19 found that only 23% professed an unwillingness to marry a non-virgin. At midnight screenings of the 1975 cult comedy The Rocky Horror Picture Show, audiences hooted and jeered when a newly engaged woman mistakes in the dark the transvestite Dr. Frankenfurter for her fiancé. And to think I was saving myself, she sobs afterward. For what? A rainy day? The audience would howl in reply. In the span of little more than a decade, a male emotion that had once seemed as primordial as lust or rage had been brusquely erased, leaving only the faintest chalk outline behind. Wharton, it turned out, had got men wrong. Or had she? Perhaps the male enthusiasm for female sexual freedom in the 70s was just as self-interested as Newland Archer's. One recent Sunday morning, a female California journalist observed in 1976, I happened to be sitting in the kitchen of a Redondo Beach house inhabited by 4 young computer engineers. Good tennis-playing semi-jock fellows they were, in tracksuits, running shoes of advanced design, and Pulsar watches. They were talking about a party they'd been to the night before, and one seemed to have been taken with a girl he'd met there. He'd given her his phone number and was plainly impatient for bells to ring. I said maybe she wouldn't think it too inexcusably pushy if he called her. He muttered something about cigarettes and left the room, while the others all looked at their fancy feet as if I'd said something particularly dumb. I began to question them, and after a little prevarication, they all said that they liked being asked out for dates by women, and that they would often sweat it out for days rather than make the first move themselves. Being invited was the greatest thing since transistorized calculators. It made them feel good and saved a lot of hassle, not to mention rejection. They all agreed that a date initiated by a woman was likely to be a more relaxed and promising occasion. You'd hardly be there if she found you repulsive. I was startled and suspicious, but they didn't seem to be exaggerating or showing off. It was as though they were researchers describing an interesting discovery that they had just made. Back in a minute. Thank you. The same demographics that had favored men over women in divorce favored young men over young women in courtship. Flick on a movie from the 1960s, and it's hard to miss the movie-making giddy awareness of being surrounded by hordes of 20-something girls. Of course, this was mostly pornographic fantasy, but it was not all pornographic fantasy. For every 4 boys born in 1945, there were 5 girls born in 1950, and while the discrepancy shrank for the later boomers, it persisted as long as the boom did. In 1955, when a 26-year-old man born in 1929 met an attractive 22-year-old woman born in 1933, he silently understood that he'd better act. She was likely to have an easier time finding another plausible suitor than he was to find an equally appealing alternative. A silent mathematical undertow tugged him to do things her way. That usually meant early engagement and marriage. The baby boom reversed the undertow's current. As Naomi Wolf sadly acknowledged in retrospect, become a woman in our culture does not mean show us you can weave, as it did in Melanesia, or even show us you can embroider samplers, direct the servants, and play a harpsichord, as it did in refined society in the 19th century in the West. No, in our culture, the cliche exclamation to an adolescent girl, "My, how you've grown," has no cultural echoes whatsoever. The reference is purely physical. In our world, demonstrate that you are a woman means simply take off your clothes. Although the sexual revolution emancipated female desire and freed women from traditional moral scrutiny, it simultaneously upped the sexual ante for them. Chanel advertised a new perfume for the youth market, number 19, with an image of a gorgeous model gripping a grinning man's head in a hammerlock and pulling him toward her for a passionate kiss. The cheaper fragrances adopted an even more aggressive tone. Taboo, fearing that its old trademark image of a romantic violinist sweeping his accompanist into his arms had fallen out of style, switched the male and female roles in his 1974 ad campaign. It was the woman who played the violin and grabbed the man. And Jolie produced a notorious commercial in which a sexy career woman performed a bump and grind in her kitchen. "I can bring home the bacon, cook it up in a pan, and never ever let him forget he's a man, 'cause I'm a woman." Susan Faludi has argued that we must distinguish between 1970s feminism and 1970s advertising. Madison Avenue and Hollywood and the fashion industry and mass media all saw a marketing opportunity in women's lib, and they ran with it. It's certainly true that Chanel, Revlon, and countless other companies saw marketing opportunities in women's lib. They saw them because they were there. Women intuited that they had better pick up the phone or pay the check or do more in bed because they knew that if they did not, there was some other woman who would. In the dark days before feminism, no respectable woman ever sat at a bar, even in the company of a bevy of girlfriends. Feminism ejected that worrisome old taboo. One of the storied moments of the feminist rebellion was a sit-in at McSorley's, an old-fashioned sawdust-on-the-floor saloon near New York University, whose doors were closed to women before 1969. Emancipated from the antiquated Victorian restrictions on where women could and could not consume alcohol, women were free to mingle with men in the new singles bars that sprang up in every American city. The first one is thought to have opened in Washington, D.C. in 1965. A newly divorced woman described with amazement her first visit to one of the new bars. The place was a meat store, people sitting around being looked over like pork chops on a tray, only nobody was selling. They were giving themselves away. Many feminist intellectuals at first enthusiastically applauded the next sexual order. Lenin hated the passivity of the proletariat much more fiercely than the villainy of the bourgeoisie. And like him, Germaine Greer was angrier with women she wanted to liberate than the men she thought oppressed them. Part of the battle will be won, Greer wrote, if women can change their attitude towards sex and embrace and stimulate the penis instead of taking it. Jay, the author of the 1969 hit The Sensuous Woman, assumes that her readers will regard fellatio as an exotic and faintly disgusting practice. In the years since then, according to the most authoritative study of American sex practices, oral sex has become as American as lo mein. While fewer than 40% of the women born before World War II had ever given or received oral sex, almost 80% of those born since the war have at least tried it. I'm not brilliant and I don't have a magnetic personality, remarks Jay, but through intelligence and hard work, I've become a sensuous woman. And that's what almost every man wants. More than beauty, more than brilliance, more than great housekeeping abilities, more than a model mother to his children, he wants a sensuous woman. The pressure to be a sensuous woman is felt in the most conservative quadrants of American society, compared to marital advice books aimed at evangelical Christian women. Helen Andolin's Fascinating Womanhood of 1963 and Maribel Morgan's The Total Woman, published in 1973. Andolin and Morgan agree that a woman can best retain and intensify her husband's love by appealing to his protectiveness and masculine pride and making a show of her own femininity. Morgan suggests that women murmur baby talk and pretend to be unable to open jars. Both authors call for submission to the husband's will. The more worldly Morgan cagily promises that by submitting the wife's will in the end, extract more goodies from her husband. They differ really on only one subject, sex. Andelin offers no sexual advice at all, aside from a blunt warning that most men will want more of it than their wives will care to give, and that women should feel no more obligation to assent to these demands than their children's requests for candy. She recommends exercise, hard work, and medicinal herbs to bring a husband's excessive appetites under control. Morgan, on the other hand, understands that under the conditions of 1973, a husband's unsatiated appetites constitute a coiled menace to hearth and home. A mistress seduces, Morgan wrote, a hausfrau submits. And Morgan's book bulges with often alarming seduction plans. She did not, as legend has it, suggest that a wife meet her husband at the front door wrapped in saran wrap, but she does propose wearing exotic costumes, cheerleader outfits, high heels, an apron, and nothing else to perk up the jaded husband. And she reminisces excitedly about the night she put the kids to bed early, cooked a romantic dinner for two to please her husband. It's all rather sad and desperate. The Stepford wives crossed with 9.5 weeks. But it spoke to somebody. The total woman outsold all the President's Men in hardcover and went on to sell another 3 million copies in paperback by the end of 1976. Today, the freeing of the American id is almost invariably described as a victory for human freedom, as grand as the Declaration of Independence or the fall of the Berlin Wall. But this upheaval had its victims, and the middle-aged women prancing around the kitchens nude but for their polyester lace aprons, grimly hoping to defend their homes, were the most comic and the most poignant of them all. For all their wildness, the 1970s were not a frivolous era. Despite the binge, America had not been transformed into a nation of good-time girls and boys. No, they are not gay, they're sober. They are even severe. They are of a pensive cast. They take things hard, one of Henry James' European characters observes of his American relatives. And the description still holds true. Americans in the 1970s were shedding all moral inhibitions for a serious reason. They were bringing an entirely new pattern of family life into being, rejecting one sexual regime and groping their way toward another. This pattern is so familiar now that it's hard to recall how vast a chasm separates it from the pattern that prevailed 50 years ago. Instead of flirtation, courtship, and marriage, modern Americans proceeded through a series of relationships. Judith Martin, the columnist better known as Miss Manners, calls this new pattern commit and switch. Open a supermarket tabloid and you'll see a headline about an actress furious that her beau of the moment is cheating on her. The actress and her beau are not married to each other. How, therefore, can he be cheating? Because as the institution of marriage has contracted, as we marry later, more briefly, more carelessly, the definition of adultery is expanded. The relationships Americans consummate begin around the time of their 16th birthday, are serious affairs, miniature marriages from which they expect all the exclusivity and intimacy of the real thing, minus only the real thing's permanency. For 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, we act like husband and wife, but we always retain our freedom to cancel at a moment's notice and start all over again with somebody else. Indeed, as Miss Manners complains, the concept of dating, keeping company with a large number of people of the opposite sex in the period before one has selected one to marry, is seen by young people nowadays as the nadir of immorality because it entails cheating on one's relationship. Relationships are not trips to the moon on gossamer wings. They are, as the thousands of relationship books warn us, hard, unremitting toil. Show me a relationship without conflict and issues, and I'll show you a couple that is either dead or in denial. One relationship guru, Barbara DeAngelis, tells her television audiences, the rebels who sparked the sexual revolution promised the country more joy, more delight, more pleasure. But, as so often happens after a revolution, the promised joy, delight, and pleasure appear only on auditory billboards erected by the revolutionary leaders, in this case, the purveyors of jeans, underwear, and perfume. And that was Voulez Vous coucher avec moi ce soir from the book The 70s, How We Got Here. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.